to connect performance and analytics with a strategy that we can implement to improve your performance. So get ready. We're going to dig a little bit into that side of our work. I think some of it is also going to be relevant for the work you do in the community as far as your interaction with the public and donors. So hope you find it helpful. And then if you have any questions, go ahead and use the chat box. I am adaptable, so I can sort of stop midstream and answer a question you might have, because as we move through the presentation, the content's going to shift over time. So we don't want to sort of get too far ahead if you have a question about what we've just presented. So I'm going to get the PowerPoint sharing here while we have the remainder of folks jumping onto the call. So give me one moment to share my screen. All right. So Kim, can you see the screen?
You're good.
All right, so our goal this part of the morning is to really explore the donor audience. So looking at the plants and really understanding how to make different types of plants thrive, and to look at donors from different views to understand the way they behave and how we can interact and communicate with those donors in a way that supports a deeper commitment to the Salvation Army's mission, as well as additional support for the programs that you have in the community. So TrueSense is embarking on a pretty big initiative to have more information about the Salvation Army's donors that we can act on. So I'm sure all of you have heard and have seen in conferences and conversations this term big data. I think one of the challenges that we all face with big data is it being actionable. What can we do with that information in a meaningful way that makes performance better or help you reach your goals? And so we'll unpack a little bit of that today. So we're being very disciplined about making sure that as we explore information about your donors and we start to organize donors by categories, we're always mindful about what we're going to do with that information. We don't want to just do this for the sake of knowing more, but helping guide our practice. One of the things that's making today's presentation possible and our ability to act on some of this knowledge is TrueSense's investment in a pretty sophisticated data warehouse where we're taking in information about donors and their giving, but also more insight into the donors themselves, and all of that living in a warehouse. So we would be able to identify, let's say, the age of a donor and what type of campaigns they're responding to, and be able to potentially adjust communication based on those variables, not just their giving history to the Salvation Army. And so this is a tool that we're pretty much at this point 90% built, and now we're building on top of it the solutions for reporting as well as implementation in campaigns. The other thing I always think is really helpful as a strategist going into conversations about audiences and matching messaging and fundraising with that audience is always being mindful that we could create a false correlation. For example, this is a great example of a correlation between an increase in violent crime and an increase in ice cream sales during the summertime, right? pretty sure that the increase in ice cream sales doesn't lead to more violent crime. It probably has more to do with the fact that it's summertime and both rise during that time. But as I go through this presentation, be mindful that sometimes we may see something that indicates a pattern, but we may not be able to see other causes or causality between the things we're looking at. So we always want to keep that in the back of our mind when we're looking at this type of approach. So one of the things we're going to do today is talk about audiences, and we have just come out of a calendar year, as Sean had talked about earlier, that has been unprecedented as far as donor giving, but also the number of new donors that gave to the Salvation Army for the first time outside of the holidays as a result of the pandemic. So I'm actually going to take a little bit of time because they are going to be an important factor for fundraising for the next 20 years. I want to talk about the donors who gave during the pandemic. So these are donors that gave between January and September of last year. And I wanted to introduce them, and I'm going to explain a little bit why we have the cast of characters from The Breakfast Club. If any of you remember this movie. And the reason I'm introducing them is because a lot of the donors who gave for the first time during the pandemic are from Generation X. And Generation X is sort of that generation people don't talk a lot about. Lots of talk about the baby boomers, lots of talk about millennials. People don't really talk about Generation X a lot. And they are the donors that definitely gave to the Salvation Army for the first time as a result of the pandemic. And so I wanted to explore a little bit of what we saw for the donors during the pandemic. So the first thing that was obvious when we look at the data, and you can see over here during third quarter, the new donors acquired, the average gift or the amount of their first gift was significantly higher than during the holiday season. So what you would typically see as far as a distribution of gifts during the holiday period, for new donors who gave as a result of the pandemic, the gift size was more significant, and that was primarily driven by online giving, which what we see is online giving typically drives a much higher gift amount. So the value of these donors from an initial gift perspective is pretty significant. The other thing to also keep in mind is that very few of these donors were acquired through a direct investment in communication, whether it was online or mail, outside of probably some search investment that was done at national headquarters. So this high value comes with very little cost of investment. The cohort of donors, we saw the significant shift from an age perspective was for donors under the age of 50. And I'd love, if you have any questions or feedback related to when you talk about a young donor, what age, and maybe we can even take a poll with people making some comment around this, but what do you consider a young donor? And we're going to keep exploring this a little bit more in our time this morning, but for purposes of the way we approach strategy, we're looking at under 50 based on sort of some common patterns of behavior for donors under that age. I'm just under 50 and I don't feel young, but definitely fall within the category of what would be considered a young donor from a life stage perspective, which we'll talk about a little bit more. Housing stability
Paul,
was
you have some chats.
Okay.
just to look at. So some of the attendees were saying 35 and below and 40 below. Yep. As for the young donors.
Yep. Yeah, and I think that's common. I think, and I have a hypothesis for why we sort of go in that direction. I think sometimes it's intergenerational. When we think of young, we think of our children. So for me, it would be, daughters who are 19 and 21. So to me, that's young. And I think sometimes because we're not thinking of that sort of subconscious bias towards what is young, or we might have employees in positions, or we think about the employees at camp, for example, who are there for the summer employment as sort of our understanding or representation of what is young. But if we look at the bell curve as far as donor age and giving, we see a concentration of donors under 50 that basically is equal to donors over 85. And we'll show you that a little bit later in the presentation. And we'll talk, I think it'd be great to talk, we'll have an opportunity to talk about life stage too as it relates to age. So the other thing that really stood out to me when I looked at demographics, and I also want to point out, this is just Texas information. This is not all of the Salvation Army. What you're looking at right now is information from Texas donors across the division, is that the pandemic caused a lot of people from unstable households to make donations. I think what happened here was a major sort of rush of empathy for friends and other people who had lost employment or their income was unstable, and the pandemic directly impacted friends and family. And for those who had continued employment, but not necessarily stable as far as household debt and assets, caused a major surge in charitable giving with that desire to have an impact out of appreciation for their continued employment. The other thing that was interesting too was a real high increase in the percentage of donors who have lived in their place of residence for less than 3 years. Again, pointing to sort of empathy as a major driver for new gifts during the pandemic. And this contrasts significantly with traditional acquisition, where one of the strongest indicators that someone is a good prospect is the length of time that they have lived in their home, which also correlates strongly with lifestyle stability or life stage stability.
And Paul, can you define what is unstable housing? The previous slide for everyone.
Household stability is consumer related. So it really has to do with sort of the balance of income and debt primarily. So, and then additional information might feed this rating based on, for example, do they rent versus own their home? So it's really about consumer stability and disposable income as the driver here for the rating of least stable to most stable. So, for example, a 35-year-old or a 40-year-old, who's got kids in the house, a mortgage, car payments, might be less stable than a 25-year-old with their first job and renting and low debt. So this has more to do with a variety of factors than income. And what I would just point out, and may be obvious to some of you, is some of these factors will create some challenges for that household as far as continued giving at the level they made during the pandemic. For households that are less stable, it would be not a surprise if we had challenges with retaining some of these donors in the future just because of the life stage they're at or their personal finances. And then the other element here that stood out strongly was how connected they are to the internet. So internet connectivity really references, do they have a high-speed internet connection? What level of subscription to streaming services? It all gets factored into this rating from most likely to least likely. And some of this obviously correlates or is directly connected to the age, that there was a younger demographic of people giving as a result of the pandemic compared to typical acquisition as definitely a factor here. But the significant difference as far as percentage of donors with much higher internet connectivity is an important factor. And obviously, a lot of the giving during the pandemic was driven by online gifts, where we saw the most sizable increase year over year. So when we sort of step back from the pandemic and we look at the new donor class of fiscal year 20 by age, again, this is actual the numbers from Texas. You can see that bell curve where the donor audience of folks acquired under the age of 50 is actually higher than those over the age of 85. And you can see the classic sort of peak charitable giving happening right there between 50 and 74 years of age. And it correlates very strongly with what you would expect a typical life stage progression to look like. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, because one of the things we can do when we look at some of the information like the age of a donor is we can cross-reference other factors like income to this and see if we're saying they're less likely, for example, to retain because they're under the age of 50, or is it because there's a higher percentage of donors with higher income who are also less likely to retain? And so as I went through all of the information and looked at those variables, it was very clear that age was the most significant factor whenever you accounted for other variables like household income. So if I looked at all of your donors whose income is between, above 250,000, the younger group would actually have the lowest retention within that income level. And so we went across all of the different possible causes that impact retention, and age by and far is one of the most significant factors as far as retention. So when we look at retention for this audience, it's 44% versus 62%. The other interesting dynamic for donors under the age of 50 is there's a concentration of donors with higher income. And as a result, the average gift for those donors is higher, $103 versus $91. So when we think about this under 50 audience, the way that I think, and I for those of you who also really want to engage donors across all lifestyle or life stages, it's really important to understand their progress over time. So if you acquire a 30-year-old donor today, they will reach peak charitable giving in 30 to 35 years from today. And so strategy that is 1 to 3 or even let's say 5 years in perspective won't even account for the length of time that you will be connected to and building a relationship with that 30-year-old donor. And obviously, we all have seen how much has changed over the last 30 years. It's difficult to even imagine what it's going to look like 30 years from today. But when we think about Generation X, every teenager like myself who watch Breakfast Club is going to reach charitable giving in the next 10 to 15 years. They really do represent that next charitable giving generation that's coming in after the boomers, and stand to inherit a massive amount of wealth from the baby boomer generation as well. So one of the things that we think about when it comes to age, and I know this is a topic regularly of conversation with people across the Salvation Army, is really understanding where life stage creates opportunity or creates challenges. So for example, for the donors who are at 30 now and disposable income is a challenge because they're carrying a mortgage and college debt and they have children, or maybe children are, they're saving for their children's university costs. That they're at a life stage where they have pretty minimal disposable income, which does factor into their giving patterns. Even as a donor, they might give more infrequently as a result of those other expenses. The other dynamic is culture. How do you talk to someone in each of these generations and life stages in a way that is more effective? And so when you are trying to think about how to do that efficiently and be able to use data to support that, it sort of led TrueSense to thinking very carefully about how we can leverage information like age in the future and building systems so that we can actually do some of that work and do testing around some of what we find both in feedback from donors and from the Salvation Army, but also what we see in the data itself. So age is definitely an important factor. The other one that definitely we see challenges when it comes to retention, as an example, is household income. One of the ongoing conversations in the Salvation Army comes down to acquisition amounts and the value of an acquisition class. So for every donor we're going to acquire in, let's say, fiscal year 20, what's the lifetime potential of revenue from that group of donors that we acquire? I remember I worked for the Salvation Army, actually for a period of time with Major Rec Line in Washington, D.C. And there's a capital fund group called Carlyle Partners. And Jim Conway is a multi-billionaire. And just out of curiosity, as I was looking through some of the wealthiest people in Washington, D.C., I searched Jim and Barbara Conway in our database and found that they were donors. And 3 years previously, or maybe longer, they had made an acquisition gift of $37 to the Salvation Army. And so we see that a lot now as we start to pull in household income information on the donors that we've acquired, is that there isn't always a direct correlation between the donor's income and their amount of giving. But we definitely see a general concentration of donors, depending on age, between that $50,000 and $250,000. But there is definitely every year pockets. In this case, 7% of Texas's new donors in fiscal year 20 had household giving, or income, I should say, above $250,000. Go back to that slide in a moment. So I've looked a little bit more closely at the donors at that $250,000 or above income. And one of the most interesting things about it is that it's connected to that peak career income between the age of 50 and 64 years of age. And actually a good number of under 50 donors who also have income over this amount. For this audience, average gift is significant as far as if you look at it from an average perspective of $366 versus $76 overall for acquisition. But one of the challenges we find with this audience is in second year retention. So their retention is actually lower than your typical donor audience. And so this is an area of focus for us in upcoming testing as far as identifying ways that we might be able to address this lower retention in the second year. Once they've given 3 or more years, this audience has the same retention as someone else. So it speaks a little bit to that initial experience after making a gift and maybe their expectations not being met as a donor after having made that first gift. So this was a post office survey where one of the things that they did is did some consumer research on mail versus digital, which is a big dynamic now and increasingly in the future. So what they found was that mail was much more effective for content recall, but digital was much more effective for brand recognition. So the Salvation Army's brand is definitely supported by its digital investments. But when it comes to specific content recall, as far as the impact of the donor's giving or more detailed information about what the Salvation Army does, mail was actually more effective. And then going back to the whole conversation of age being a driver, the other factor in both areas was that for the younger audience, more emotional content drove higher recollection versus for an older audience, it was more functional information, specific information that was recalled as a result of the communication that they looked at in the study. So it speaks to, and this is why we're so committed to looking at how digital and mail function together for specific purposes in a way that makes communication with donors more effective.
Hey, Paul.
Yeah.
Roman had a question. Were you able to get that billionaire to increase their giving when you were in National Capital?
No. I think for major giving, and this is where I think where we see the second year and where our access now to household income can become a factor even in the way we engage donors. When a donor of that stature makes a gift, one, it may not have even been them. It could have been their business manager or office manager has, directive to give to any charity who sends them something. But it's really that missed opportunity as far as engaging that whole household and creating an opportunity or a pipeline. And we'll talk a little bit about pipeline today as we explore ways we navigate these issues. But just even getting a meeting with them would have been incredibly difficult because of their other commitments in place already. So I saw it more of a missed opportunity than an actual opportunity to engage that family. So no.
And Paul, there was another question from Patrick. Have you done any study for cross-referencing the CARES Act stimulus and induced giving from donors?
Yeah, we did look. So one of the things I sort of looked at was giving related to the size of the stimulus checks. So, for example, gifts at $1,200. I didn't see we see gifts that were $1,200 in the data, but we don't necessarily see that as the biggest driver. Partly because I think a lot of people who gave as a result of the stimulus gave to more than one organization, so we wouldn't necessarily have seen that connection in the data itself. But it definitely was a factor that really did contribute to charitable giving, in the same way as we now see very strong correlations to less giving in 2019 as a result of the tax law change. So the reverse correlation, which we'll actually look at here.
Great. Thanks, Paul.
Those are great questions. Speaking of which, so one of the challenges for donors who are from high household income households or people of wealth and giving is a pretty big change, in the same way that online giving is changing a lot of dynamics and changing the way people give. There's a lot of trends right now for high income households that are impacting charitable giving. Down at the bottom left, one of the most significant impacts right now is the growing trend to make charitable giving through a donor advised fund. And this was accelerated by the tax law change, because now donors, instead of giving every year a certain amount that they might deduct from their charitable giving, because of how high the standard deduction is, a lot of donors are taking a significant amount of assets all at once, giving it to a donor advised fund and getting the charitable giving benefit on their taxes in that year, but waiting to distribute the gift from their donor advised fund into the future. And especially with a stock market that's been going up, many donors are looking at their DAF, their donor advised fund, and it's growing as a result of the stock market going up. And I think what happens is they think, well, if I wait another year, I can give even more to charity, instead of saying, no, I need to give right now to charity. And so there's this tendency for quite a number of donors to just put their charitable giving into a donor advised fund and then sit on it and not distribute it. And so this is one area where we're working with some Salvation Armies to communicate directly with these donors and create a case for giving. But a major difference for high wealth households is their giving is definitely more impact focused. And it's not just about what to give or why they should give, but it also has a lot to do with when they give. And if you think about traditional direct marketing communication, we make a lot of decisions about communication based on when the donor last made a gift. But if you have a donor who likes to distribute gifts, every 2 or 3 years, and they make a $5,000 gift, and then they go quiet for the next 2 years, and then they make another $5,000 gift, it is a factor that we have to consider when we're doing our planning for these types of households. The other thing that is important to recognize is that their decision to give, the drive to give, is based on a desire to have an impact, but it's within a larger calculation of their income and management of their personal wealth. So, if there's a change in tax law, for those households, their giving might decline because their initial gift took into consideration the impact of the tax benefit. So for many of these donors, and I've had personal conversations with donors where they've said, well, if I don't have that tax credit, I'm going to give you the same as I did last year, but for you, it's going to be less, because the tax benefit allowed me to make a gift 40% higher because of the charitable deduction than I would typically do, right? So for me, you got $10,000, but because of the tax deduction, I only gave $6,000. But with that tax deduction gone, or that credit gone, I'm still going to give you $6,000. So it's definitely the dynamics as far as communication and the way we engage with these types of households shifts significantly from the traditional smaller gift donor that supports the Salvation Army. The other thing, too, that I found really interesting in this one study by the U.S. Trust was that people's charitable donations decreased when they thought government spending was wasteful. So the dynamics of what government is doing with charitable or with taxes is actually influencing charitable giving to organizations like the Salvation Army. So any sort of increase or decrease in confidence in what's happening in government does have an impact on organizations like the Salvation Army financially. So before we sort of shift to talking about specific programs, just some of the takeaways from this that we're sort of exploring. For those under $50 donors, many of them make larger gifts online, but make donations less often. So we're seeing this connection, between donor makes $100 gift. They may say, well, I gave you a $100 gift, a couple of years ago. I'm going to wait for a while before I make another one because of the size of that gift. So one of the things we're looking at is, can we actually nurture more consistency in giving with lower second asks or sustainer giving to help navigate disposable income challenges? A great way of framing this is a question. We ask this internally, and it doesn't necessarily have a direct answer. But if a new $100 donor becomes a $5 monthly donor, did you downgrade their giving to $60? Or did you increase their lifetime value to $160? And it all comes down to whether we could have renewed their giving at that $100 amount or not. And certainly when we look at lower retention for certain donor audiences, this question is important as we explore ways to allow donors to support the Salvation Army more consistently and over a longer period of time by looking carefully at what we ask them to commit to. And then for high value donors, one of the things that we've shifted in our mid-level communication to donors who give above 1,000 is, can we help improve retention and build a pipeline to major giving by providing greater detail and programs and services, and not just tie it to how much they give, but even starting to use donor income information to shift and communicate with that audience. So some of the testing that we're doing is actually taking the same type of communication that higher value donors are getting, and then looking at that next tier of donors and seeing if it has a positive impact on their giving. So that's part of our testing for the upcoming year. So as we shift to now talking about some of the programs that exist to address these different questions that we've explored, part of it is the question of push versus pull. So in marketing, pushing is really what we do when we send direct mail out. We push a lot of communication out to donors and present to them an opportunity to give and ask them to make a gift. That is very different than a program like Army of Hope, where we're pulling the donor. We're sort of inviting them to consider and opt into a different way of communication with the Salvation Army. And so Army of Hope is an excellent example of letting donors choose for themselves something that is better for them versus us trying to figure out what works best for them based on lots of kinds of information. So now we're going to go into conversation about some of the strategies that we have in place for looking at audiences and matching audience with the right type of communication. So I'm going to pass over to Kim to talk about the Army of Hope program first. And before we go there, is there any other feedback or questions from that early section? It was a lot, so don't want to move on too quickly if anyone's got any comment or question.
Well, there's nothing additional at this time on the chat.
Okay, cool.
Oh, wait, we just got another, Diana. Who are the most popular DAF companies, and does the Salvation Army conduct specific marketing to those companies?
So the biggest is Fidelity as far as giving. Charles Schwab is also a large donor advised fund. And then a lot of community foundations have set up donor advised funds as part of their portfolio of giving. We have, this is where data is sometimes the biggest challenge, is knowing whether or not a donor is actively giving through their donor advised fund, and also recognizing that sometimes donors make outright gifts and donor advised fund giving. So we've actually been doing some direct communication with donors in the Western Territory where they've identified all of their donor advised fund donors who are not anonymous, and we're actually communicating with them because it's about really making a strong case that says now is the right time to distribute from your DAF because of how much need there is in the community. Don't wait. Make your gift now to the donor advised fund. The other approach that the Salvation Army can do is actually engage with these companies to make sure that donors have all the right information as far as distribution of their gift. So there are opportunities for the Salvation Army to connect with the different DAF companies to make sure that the Salvation Army's information is up to date and accurate within their systems. But generally speaking, the most important thing is to know and to keep track of donors who give this way within your database so that you can communicate with them appropriately and credit them for the value of their giving through that donor advised fund. Knowing there's always going to be a certain percentage that are anonymous. Because that's one thing about a donor advised fund is the donor controls how much information the charity gets about the donor's giving as well. And so you might just get a gift from an anonymous donor and you'll never know where that gift came from.
Great question.
Yeah.
That's it for right now, Paul.
Okay. Well, I'll pass it over to Kim.
So Paul, are you going to still drive for me though?
Yeah, I can do that.
Awesome.
Just go beep or something like the old.
I will like do the Carol Burnett, pull my ear or something like that. And that is really showing my age for sure. Yes, I'm going to talk a bit about the Salvation Army's, our Army of Hope program. And while quite a few of you are probably very intimately aware of how the program works and functions, I know there's quite a few folks here who may know of it and heard of it, but may not have a lot of detail. But before I start on my slides, I would like to make a personal pitch to this captured audience of Texans. My husband and I are moving to New Braunfels, Texas, to be closer to family. So I'd appreciate anyone from that area who's got great insight into restaurants and activities. Feel free to ping me separately outside of this. I'm looking forward to being part of the group down there. So, all right. So Paul, can you go to the next slide, please? So basically, where did we come from? The Army of Hope, and previously known as Friends of the Army, has been a program that True Sense has had for now over 20 years. It's been amazing how long this program has developed and the differences and impacts and improvements that we've made over the years. And actually in this last couple of years, some of them have been pretty significant. And to Paul's point before, data really drives the efficiency, effectiveness of this program. And so those things are very tied together in terms of how this program performs. So our longest participating division currently has over 16,000 donors in the program, and it represents, over 3 million, almost 4 million of their revenue. So it is something that can, very much like the seed analogy that we've been talking about, it starts small, but it can really over time grow and be very significant. All right. So looking at the main different area commands within that we work with in the division, we're looking right now at the number of members that are currently in the program by those areas, and showing you basically from the start through current calendar year specifically what those numbers look like. So when I'm talking about members, I'm talking about folks that are currently active in your program. From year to year to year. So you can kind of see, again, that analogy of we're starting small, inviting donors into it, and then growing and increasing those members over the years. So when we're talking about enrollment, it's a little different scenario. So we're looking at, I think for most people that are more familiar with the program, we do invitations twice a year. And so right now, this is the number of people that enroll into the program. It doesn't necessarily mean they'll stay active, just like any other donor that you have. Retention is a factor here. But this kind of shows you based on the number of campaigns that we do, be it digital and or through direct mail and or through DET, where we're inviting donors to enroll in the program. You can see year over year how those numbers have increased. And some of the numbers and dips and rises that you see have been changes in the strategy there in terms of that individual area, in terms of if we're doing DET or not doing DET. So there's some nuances there that that impact obviously those numbers.
And DET is the donor engagement team. That's the calling program.
Thank you. So in terms of revenue by location, again, this is something that we've broken down by calendar year for each of the area commands, as well as DHQ, core, and service extensions. So again, what we want to see is this continual rise in revenue, and very much like the division that started, 20 some odd years ago, right now that continuing to build on that progress and those donors and treating them effectively and making sure that the data is effectively categorizing them so that we can make sure that we are, one, giving them the choice and the control that they want, but also making the promise and keeping our communication with them impactful and meaningful in order for them to continue to want to be in the program. So Army of Hope Reminder Performance. So as you know, the majority of the donors currently are folks that are giving by check, be it monthly, quarterly, or semi-annually. But because you would think that sort of communication where you're sending out a reminder would impact retention and maybe people would be dropping off. The ROI on just those reminders, so this isn't even folks that are giving automatically, is 33 to 1 ROI, which is, is very significant, and obviously an ROI that you do not see outside of the Army of Hope program in our normal direct response communication. So we want to make sure that we are communicating to donors who really are wanting to be committed to the Army. In the past, we had an annual option for donors to give and be part of the program because we wanted it to be very donor controlled and give them all the options that we thought would make sure that they would stay in the program. And what we found is that the annual donors did not retain, because a lot of the times they were checking that box off. I'm going to give you one gift a year. They weren't actually fulfilling to that gift. So for us, that particular donor being part of a sustainer program just didn't really make sense. What the Army of Hope is for those donors who really do want to give to you. They really do want to have control, and they really are committed to giving to you in a long term. So when we're looking at the difference between retention of those donors who are giving more frequently, it's an 18% increase in their retention versus the annual donors, or those who are giving less frequently, is a 6% reduction in their retention. So Army of Hope is definitely a multi-channel program. So it started off, I'm sorry, Carrie, did you have a question? Was
Yeah,
there a
but go ahead and finish this one, and then I'll get to
Okay.
the next one.
All right. We really started out, obviously, 20 years ago. It was very direct mail focused. There was no online. That wasn't even part of the vernacular in those days. But obviously, we've grown the program to reach donors and basically reduce barriers. Is for me the emphasis of this program is reducing any barrier for a donor to give, whether they want to give online, through EFT, through credit card. What can we do to make the program just be easy for them and effective for them in order to give? So while we're covering all those channels, we keep that in mind that regardless of what channel the donor chooses to make their gift in, we just want to make it easy and effective for them and not create any barriers for them to want to continue to give. So as I mentioned before, we do 2 direct mail invitations, typically in February and the other in July. We also, for some areas where we use our high touch phone calling group, which is the donor engagement team that we talked about earlier, we will use phone, which is a very effective way to invite donors into the program. We also use digital invitation campaign that sort of surrounds the direct mail invitation so that we're exposing donors to that offer in multiple different ways during that time frame. We also want to make sure that we're having effectively multi-channel way to address lapsing donors or donors that are about to become inactive. So we have created in this last year a lapsed donor calling for those that are using our DET group. For as soon as we set business rules for what type of donor is lapsing based on their frequency, be it monthly, quarterly, or semi-annually, and then at that particular juncture, connecting with them to make sure that we're going to try to stop lapsing those donors. And we find that communication through phone is very effective in getting those donors, whether it's they just can't give anymore, they need to adjust their giving, whatever the case may be. We want to make sure that we're effectively communicating with them and very quickly. We also use calling for maintenance and upgrade types of offers as well. So if their address is changing, or they want to change their credit card number, or they want to either go from being a monthly because they now need to be a quarterly donor because of income situation, we can make those adjustments too, and it gives them a touch point as well to communicate how the program is working for them. Again, we have a lot of donors who, even in this day and age, still feel more comfortable giving by check. So we continue to have a direct mail monthly reminder program that sends those reminders to those donors based on obviously their frequency of when they want to give. And that's again correlated back to that ROI that I spoke to earlier. And then the final communication in terms of related directly to their giving is an annual statement that goes out in February that really wants to show them all of their gifts that they did the previous calendar year so that they have that sort of documentation. It also gives them an opportunity to adjust their giving either in frequency or dollar amount. But I think what is really been a big change for us in terms of trying to drive donors to automatic giving for their ease as well. So that's been a big proponent of how we've made some adjustments to not only our direct mail reminders, but our calling and even the annual statement. So Carrie, is there a question I should address?
Yes, Nicholas Hutchinson had a great question. So he sees the Army of Hope branding, and this past Christmas, our media really pushed the message of Join Loves Army, Rescue Christmas. Are we running a risk of watering down our message or presenting confusing messages for our donors based on these different names? Great question.
It is a good question. Yeah, and with Army of Hope, I don't feel like it is conflicting because in some ways it's sort of reinforcing that same messaging across the national campaigns as well as what they're actually seeing in their mailbox or in their inbox. So I don't believe, and also the timing of when we are typically doing our Army of Hope is not right around the conjunction of that Christmas campaign. So there is some separation of time and space there that I don't think that at this juncture it's been too conflicting in terms of messaging. Okay, so let's talk some about the advancements that we've made in the program in the last couple of years. So very specifically for the Texas division was moving the naming from Friends of the Army, excuse me, to Army of Hope. And we'll talk a bit about that in a minute. Again, we updated the business rules for the direct mail reminders so that we really wanted to make sure that we had solid rules around how is someone interpreted as being lapsed? What does that look like based on every single variation of their frequency? And then based on that, how do we then address it? Because we also know that part of this program is keeping it up to date in terms of if there are folks that clearly are inactive and are no longer giving, what are we doing on the data side to make sure that those donors are appropriately changed in the system as not being part of the program? And then what are we going to do in terms of recommunicating with them? But we want to make sure the data is as important to knowing that who that donor is that's in the program and what their chosen frequency and dollar amount. And it's almost as important, if not more, of what are those donors who are inactive and no longer giving, that they're also currently and correctly noted in the data system as such. You're going to hear this a lot. Data is everything. And it really does impact everything, every decision that we make. Again, I mentioned earlier that we have made a concerted effort in the copy on the direct mail side for those donors that are choosing to give by check, as well as in their annual statement to encourage recurring giving through EFT and or credit card. We are trying to make that adjustment as much as possible. And then obviously, if donors give online, they're already considered a recurring giver through their credit card. So we're trying to make that adjustment as time moves forward, because as we know, more and more transactions are being managed online. So we want to make sure that we're trying to make that language and message adjustment to recurring giving. And I talked about the monthly calling for lapsed donors that are in the program. Again, trying to encourage them to give or make adjustments to their membership if necessary based on their current situation. We have worked with THQ specifically on some of the inactive donors that they've been noted as Army of Hope or Friends of the Army people are members, and they have not given in multiple years. So we have I've been very generous in terms of isolating those donors and making sure that we can systematically get an update on them. But we're now doing that on a monthly basis. So part of the monthly reminder program is also identifying what are the new batch of inactives, and then making sure that we are communicating those effectively so that the data can be updated accordingly. We are not offering the annual as an option to new members. Obviously, we're not adjusting people that were sort of, for the lack of a better term, grandfathered in as an annual donor. But we know that looking at the data, that those donors are not really committed to you. They're not really a sustaining donor. And based on the retention of those donors, it felt like that option wasn't really necessary or effective in terms of growing the program. We did this last year based on what Paul was talking about, that donors really want to know where their giving is going and what impact their giving is making. And an Army of Hope donor is no different. They may be giving in a different way, but they still want that feedback. They still want to know that what they're doing is making a difference. And so our impact report became a new part of the communication that we've added to the calendar for our Army of Hope members. And it provides them with very specific feedback on terms of what their giving is going to and how they are actually making a difference in their communities. And we're also talking about, we've developed a welcome letter for new enrollments. So you have a lot of donors entering a sustainer program across the transom in different ways, either going to a national donation page or just, it isn't always necessarily through an Army of Hope invitation or an Army of Hope email or donation page. So we want to make sure that as we build this program that we're treating all those donors who choose to give in this fashion in the same way. We're doing effective and good communication with them at a cadence that's appropriate, but that we're also making sure that they feel special and they feel part of this group and they kind of know what that means. So we're developing a welcome letter to cover enrollments, not only for those people who know they're signing up for Army of Hope, but also for those donors who may be joining a sustainer program or are a sustainer donor, but haven't actually gone through an Army of Hope donation page specifically. And thank you, Roman and Joshua. I will look forward to your information about New Braunfels.
All right, thank you, Kim. So the other group that we have made some significant changes starting in 2018 was communication to higher value donors. So just as a means of sort of defining this audience, currently, when we talk about a mid-level donor, this is someone who's giving over $1,000 in cumulative giving over a 12-month period and is not currently assigned to a major giving portfolio. What we see in other organizations is often the amount of giving is directly tied to portfolio assignment. So within the industry, mid-level is traditionally between $1,000 and $10,000 in giving to an organization. And if we go back to sort of some of the dynamics with this audience, one of the changes that we made is really to introduce more direct contact and education with the donor. I've been working now for over 15 years with the Salvation Army, and I've regularly heard and at times thought about this myself, is that donors often don't know or don't know well what the Salvation Army is doing. Their giving is often connected to the strength of the Salvation Army's reputation in the community. And it's less driven by the donor's desire to have an impact in a particular way. And that can be really positive as far as, new donor acquisition for the Salvation Army. That often translates into higher response rates in acquisition, that really strong brand that the Salvation Army has. But I do think that it can also be a deficit when it comes to retention. And for higher value donors, there is a shift to really wanting to ensure that their gift has a real direct impact in the community and is responsive to issues that they are concerned about for where they live. So when we looked at the mid-level donor audience, it was really about we do a survey to learn more about what they're concerned about, why they give to the Salvation Army, just to continue to learn on an annual basis about that audience and their priorities. But then it was really introducing mailings that go much deeper into the impact of their giving and how the Salvation Army is serving their community. And so the impact report's a key element to the strategy in April, which is also a peak time for donors who give during the holidays who might make a second gift. And then it's followed up in May with a prospectus that goes into much greater detail on concerns in the community, areas where the Salvation Army is responding, and how the donor can make a significant impact with their donation. One of the elements for testing in this upcoming year is to look at how this communication, starting in January with sort of a leadership renewal mailing and the survey, all the way through the prospectus in May, what kind of impact does this have on retention and giving amounts? And so we're actually going to be testing pretty widely this multi-campaign communication. And the way we're approaching it is really looking at donors with the potential of becoming mid-level donor audiences, whether that's based on giving that's between 500 and 1,000 currently, or based on income potentially, as well as donors who have recently lapsed. So they had been giving 1,000 and are no longer giving. And so we're really looking forward to digging deeper into this audience to understand how income and giving amounts factor into the type of communication the donor should be receiving, and crafting something that adds value from a retention perspective, but also creating a pipeline. We talked about donors who make smaller gifts, but over time their value grows, and at some point they become a very strong prospect for a major giving portfolio. So this program is really designed as a bridge between those two things. The other area where we have already started some work and will continue to accelerate testing is really understanding, for donors who fulfill their giving using an online donation form, how can we use direct mail and digital communication to engage this donor, to educate them about their impact, and create a case for giving? We actually did that for the coronavirus donors back in April, where we sent a postcard with an update on the impact of their giving. And when we looked at the donors who received the postcard versus those who didn't, and compared year over year performance in August, so a few months after the postcard, we noticed a significant increase in giving from that audience, so second gift conversions that came in during that time frame. There's going to be a positive lift and impact from COVID, so one of the things we'll be doing in the upcoming fiscal year is doing some additional testing with postcards driving online behavior. So one of the first tests that we're doing is an actual Giving Tuesday in the mail postcard to online-only donors in advance of Giving Tuesday, but actually doing a full 50-50 test, so we can see how did the offline communication positively impact online revenue generation. And so probably over the 3 different times over the upcoming fiscal year, we're going to be doing testing around this to identify how communication might change and evolve over time. Very practically, if you're giving on a donation form online, you don't even need a remit and a return envelope. And so just even the way we approach design and content offline is a factor when we're thinking about online donor audiences. And so this is a beginning of a lot of work as we evolve from being an offline lockbox check writing donor audience to primarily online giving as a way of fulfilling on a donation.
What always helps me, and I'll chime in here, what always helps me think about this sort of correlation between online and offline giving is typically asking the question, how many catalogs did you get in the mail in this week? And how that's a perfect correlation between a direct mail, offline, traditional way of communicating in order to build online transactions as well. So Obviously, major retailers are using that approach, and they wouldn't spend that kind of money on those catalogs if it didn't work. So it's sort of making sure that that's sort of what we're talking about, is again meeting the donor where they are at that time, and reducing the barrier for them to give either online, and using all channels to sort of encourage that interaction.
Yeah. Yeah, great example. If you recall back to the holidays, Amazon sent out a gift catalog this previous holiday that was actually data driven down at the donor level, or not donor level, the consumer level, based on your behavior and information they have about you on Amazon. And it came with links and QR codes for any of the items in that catalog, how to go online and purchase those items. So there's definitely a strong opportunity here, and it's probably the space right now visually where there's the least amount of competition for attention. If you're getting 50 emails a day, if you're lucky, 100 or more, you're seeing thousands of ads online when you're browsing the internet. Pardon me, your direct mail, your mailbox. You might typically see 5 to 10 pieces of mail. The opportunity to engage someone more directly is significantly higher in the mail. And so it's an area where we want to keep sort of crafting our approach depending on how the audience behaves when it comes to their giving behavior. So thanks for your time today. I know it's a lot. We'd be happy to share the slides, or if there's follow-up conversation that you'd like to have, we're definitely open to engaging. Client feedback, your experience can inform our strategy and make our work better. So definitely encourage you to reach out to us if you'd like to talk a little bit more in depth about what we covered during this time.
Thanks, Paul. And tomorrow we'll start at 2 p.m. And go to 5 p.m. to review, along with the Seeds of Success theme, Nurturing Your Garden, and that will be with Stacy and myself, Carrie. And then Talking to Your Plants, and that will be with David Torres, who is our creative director, who will talk to you about the art of storytelling, which is a really great section. So please attend to that as well. But again, thank you for your time. I've recorded both of these sessions, and we'll do so tomorrow as well. So we will have those available to you for download whenever you want. All right, everyone. Well, thank you again for your time, and we'll talk to you tomorrow.